The world today continues to be one great mission field, even in countries that have a long history of Christian traditions. The late Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, once said, "It is not enough for us to discover Christ, we must also bring him to others."
I also am delighted to follow Mark. I love his faith, I love his story, I love his singing. Next week I have the opportunity to interview for my show the Irish tenor Ronan Tynan, and I'm going to say to Ronan, I met the real Irish tenor, and I met him in Irvine, but Mark is an amazing man, and it's great to be here. I loved his comments about the Irish and the Italian. Some of you may know this already, but don't be fooled by Lisante, which is Italian, because I have an Irish Catholic mother. Last name is McNeil. So I am the best of both worlds, you know? Half. When you're Irish and Italian, half of your sins, the other half feels guilty about it, you know? I'll let you figure out which is which, you know? I also am standing before you this year as a fellow who has is just about to observe his 25th year as a priest, and I say to you, as someone who was very much Hamlet in his style of to be or not to be, and wavered for a long time before committing, that maybe following up on some of what Father Don was saying, it is the greatest and most wonderful life in the world to serve the church in any way. Your sacrament, your vocation, and I say as a priest with my vocation, there is nothing better in the world. And for anyone here who is thinking about the possibility of religious vocation, I warmly encourage you to think about it, because it has been for this guy who hesitated before falling off the fence, the greatest experience in the world. And what I ask you to do is to pray that others will fall off the fence, that others will see the needs of our church, that others will not be intimidated by what we've gone through in these past 3 or 4 years, and instead see that for most priests, this is a wonderful and rich and great life if we have the courage to embrace it. So I ask you to pray for me on my 25th anniversary, and to pray for all priests, many of whom are frankly still in the discouraged mode. You know, what I do now is most of my talks around the country are not for lay groups. Most of the talks I give are for clergy conferences. I go from diocese to diocese to speak to priests about getting back on the horse and riding again, and being proud of who we are and what we accomplish, and to be truly noble knights for the cause of Jesus and his mother Mary. But I would be less than honest if I didn't tell you there are some who are so discouraged. And I think in the end, that's got to be one of the greatest and most serious difficulties in the church. I love so much in the movie It's a Wonderful Life. In the beginning, St. Peter and St. Joseph are talking in heaven about George Bailey. And George Bailey's played, of course, by Jimmy Stewart. He thinks his life without meaning. That night, he's about to commit suicide. And Joseph and Peter are talking, and he calls for Clarence, the as yet wingless guardian angel, and says, "We're sending you down tonight to help George Bailey." And he says, "Clarence, is he sick?" And Peter says, "Worse than that, he's discouraged." Discouragement is truly one of the great, great burdens of American life, and certainly in the priesthood of priestly life. In the early church, it's interesting, but if you were to look at the Shepherd of Hermas in the record of what they considered to be the most serious conflicts of conscience and sin, at the very top of the list wasn't murder or sexual impropriety, but right at the top of the list was tristitia, which is dejection, despair, or a lack of hope. That this is one of the greatest burdens of all. And I'm saying to you, for many of us in the priesthood, this has been our lot over the past several years. But I believe with the power of prayer and the support of great people like you, our priests can come back again. And more to the point, that new people, like Father Don, will step forward and say, "This is a just cause worthy of my life," and put themselves on the line and become, as he said, great John Paul and Pope Benedict priests as well. I had mentioned before in the biography my experience with Fox, and I would just say that has been a great experience always, but especially this past year. What a richness we had, and we've had the downside of the media. but what a richness we experienced in being able to see all media throughout the country celebrate and remember the incredible gift to the world, not just the church, of John Paul II. We had an opportunity to teach what we really believe as Catholics and to correct the misimpressions given by the popular media so often. And I'll be speaking about the media in the morning tomorrow. But it was a wonderful thing. I remember one moment, Shepherd Smith was in Rome, and we were dialoguing about John Paul's life, and he said, well, Monsignor, you'd have to admit at least that he was essentially an anti-feminist. And I was able to say for that national and international audience, Shepherd, I know you're not Catholic, but I have to tell you, you're completely and totally wet. This man is the exact opposite of the anti-feminist. He celebrates what is most sacred in the lives of women. That of all the people in the world, they are given the grace of being life givers and life bearers, and that nothing is more noble than that. Even my curmudgeonly friend Bill O'Reilly was nice to the Pope that time. Story about Bill. Bill and I spar all the time, and I know he's very popular with a lot of people. They like his intelligence. He's articulate. I admit all that, but he's a nasty man. If you met him, you wouldn't like him. Some people say, well, no, if you see him on TV, that's his public personality. But even privately, he's a pain in the neck. I mention this because I thought during Pope John Paul's life, he was sometimes much too critical of the Holy Father, and I let him know that. I much prefer a guy like Sean Hannity or even more Neil Cavuto to Bill O'Reilly. But anyway, about a year or so ago, I'm in Barnes & Noble. I'm signing copies of my book, and people come up and they ask you questions while you're signing. And one woman says to me, I heard you talk about your experience of the media and about Fox News, but what do you think of this guy, Bill O'Reilly? And I said, normally I would say he's rude, he's arrogant, he's condescending, he's a curmudgeon, he's not my cup of tea. For some reason, let it be considered to be the Spirit of God. But something made me say, he's Catholic, he goes to Mass every week, he's trying to raise his kids in a Catholic way, he's smart, he's articulate, he's on the point more often than not. I'd have to say I have great admiration for Bill O'Reilly, at which point this nice old woman, a smile lit her face as she said, I'm so happy to hear that, Father. Billy is my son. Be careful where you open your mouth. Let me move into the topic. I've been asked to speak, perfectly placed, I hope, just before our celebration of the Mass. And you say, a priest talking about the Eucharist, what else is new? We've all heard it before. And yet I'm going to suggest to you that that's precisely our problem. That's precisely the point. Let me go back to something that happened 25 years ago. It was the day before, January 31st, the day in which I was ordained. And I was in a little chapel at St. Boniface Church in Elmont, New York. I was practicing how to celebrate Mass. I got about halfway through the experience and just stopped cold with this painful awareness, which is why I can resonate so much with Father Don, of the awareness of my incredible set of clay feet and the reality that I am a stupid, weak, imperfect human being, and who am I to celebrate the Eucharist? And the truth is, all those things I thought about myself remain true today. And 25 years later, thousands of Masses later, I still find myself awestruck that God uses what the world considers weak and foolish and stupid to confound the strong and the powerful. That God uses us imperfect as we are. And that sense of awe, that sense of reverence, that sense of amazement, that this bread is now about to become body and soul of Jesus, was an amazing, amazing experience for me. One I cannot forget 25 years later. Why do I mention it? Because I would hope and pray that I and every priest out there and every person who calls himself a Catholic Christian would find it in their heart to recapture the sense of awe and reverence and wonder and amazement and delight that we once felt for the Eucharist. You know when you see it when you're a pastor? I'm the pastor of St. Thomas the Apostle Parish in West Hempstead, New York, a parish of 4,000 families. Interestingly enough, also the parish where I grew up. And I like to point out to people that when I went there 9 years ago as pastor and I realized I had attended the Catholic grammar school, I went on a tour of this plant that I knew so well from growing up there. The very first thing I did was to go to the Catholic grammar school. The very first thing I did was to go to the principal's office and to say to her, please step outside the door for a second. She said, why? I said, I'll explain to you later. And I immediately removed my academic records. They will never be found again. But it's great to be at St. Thomas. But at St. Thomas, one of the things I get to do is I get to celebrate every May 5 First Communion celebrations. And I get to look into the eyes of these kids of 6 and 7 and 8 years of age and to see the wonderment, the delight, the excitement, the amazement that this thing they used to practice with in class, this piece of bread, is it bread anymore? I say to them as they gather around the table, no. They gather around the altar and I say, what is this now? It's Jesus. And they say it with delight and wonder and awe. And I'm here to say to you what I felt 25 years ago about the amazing experience of celebrating the Eucharist as a priest. What all of us experienced at our First Communion is something I'm afraid we at times lose, not because of some crisis of faith, not because we're in any way turning against Jesus or his sacrament, but simply because especially the people here, the people who are very much the bedrock of the church, we do it so often, it becomes for us at times commonplace. It's one more Mass, one more experience of going through the motions. And I'm going to suggest to you that if we want to make of this conference a great experience, then when we come to Mass today, that there be in our hearts and souls and minds an ability to recapture some of the greatness and wonder of what we knew so many years ago. I'm going to suggest to you, too, that we all of us fall victims of complacency, of going through the motions. The truth is, if any priest here says to you that he has celebrated thousands of Masses and has in every single experience been completely in the experience and can tell you that he's never had to think, what am I doing after Mass? Who am I seeing? Where am I going? What hospital am I visiting? What things do I have to get accomplished today? How am I going to pay the bills of this parish? Anyone who says he was never distracted is either a saint or he should go to confession. Which, by the way, is something again for us. As we so often hear sins, we get into this habit, some of us, of not being attentive to our duty to go and confess our sins. And let's face it, for none of us is confession ever an easy experience. To expose ourselves to the light of God's truth and his healing grace is for all of us a humbling moment. Wouldn't we all rather say, I'll just talk to God about it, than put my sins on the table in front of another human being and say, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I go to a parish, St. Francis, which is in New York City. It's right next door to Penn Station. It's a beautiful church that has confession pretty much 24/7. You can go in almost any time, and I have found the perfect priest for me in that St. Francis church. He doesn't speak a word of English. And my Spanish is not so hot either, so we're a perfect team. And did you ever notice how when you're talking to people who are born someplace else, you tend to speak louder thinking they'll understand better that way? So I think the people outside the box have heard all my sins as well. I remember Father Jose saying to me one day, Jimmy, you know I am Spanish, not deaf. You don't have to say it this loud. But all of us need to focus. You know how in our families, sometimes things are right in front of us and we don't see them? And that's what I think we do ourselves with the Eucharist and the Mass. It's the greatness of God coming to us, not in symbol alone, but in reality. When we say the words at Mass, this is my body, he's not saying, it's kind of like my body, it's sort of like my body, it's my body if you want it to be. He's saying, this is my body. This is my blood. Jim and everyone else there, I am fully and completely present for you here and now. What an amazing thing that is. And for us to lose a perspective of the greatness because of our complacency, because of distraction, because we've gone through it a million times before, would be truly to miss something so wonderful and so great. Let's not become complacent. But today when we celebrate Mass, let's look again at that host as if we were, because we are seeing and meeting God himself. Second thing I'm going to suggest to you that we always keep in mind, we are a very strongly Eucharistic people. And thank God, again under John Paul II, we've returned to that sense of amazement at the greatness of the Eucharist. But I don't want us to lose sight of an important reality of the Mass, because it can make of this experience a single or privatized experience between you and me and Jesus, which it is, but it's much more. Jesus is truly present in his sacrament, and that sacrament is the Eucharist, is the Mass. And he is really present. When we come together as believers, he's present and real in this family who are today in this Irvine Center. In other words, Jesus is met first just in our gathering. Jesus is here in people you don't know. Jesus is here in people whose stories you might not yet understand. And yet he is truly and actually and really present in us. We can sometimes, as we should, focus on Jesus in the sacrament of the Eucharist, and sometimes miss the reality that he is all around us, and that our job in loving him is to love his people. We must also absolutely keep in mind, which is why we need to work in all of our churches on improving the quality of reading, because Jesus is also absolutely and truly present in his word, in sacred scripture. That we meet Jesus at Mass three ways: in the people of God who make up his body, who are his instruments for accomplishing in the world all that needs to be accomplished. That we meet him in his word when we listen to the sacred scriptures. And that's why when we get some people who are mumbling the words or not reading correctly or not pronouncing and proclaiming it with joy and enthusiasm, I want to say, what are you doing? You're taking the word of Jesus. You're taking the word of the Lord, and you're not filling it with the enthusiasm that it so deeply and richly deserves. And finally, we meet him powerfully, wonderfully in that great experience which is communion, that great experience which is Eucharist. I want to talk, too, about the Last Supper for a few moments. And I think this is perfectly timed to coincide with what many of us are experiencing in recent debates in our own country about what communion is and what it is not, who should receive it and who should not. And I'd ask you to keep in mind, because I think it's so important, that we have always, you and I, been part of what I call, and I mean no irreverence by this, but we are part of a loser faith. What do I mean by that? People say, loser faith, what does he mean? What I mean is, if you count on being a Catholic Christian leading you to earthly victory here and now, you're living in a dream world. Even in matters of public policy, did you notice that we never really win? We will forever speak about the sacredness of preborn life. We will say that all life is sacred. All life must be defended. Every life is a gift from God. No person has ever been created who is a mistake in the mind of God. That there never has been, there never will be one baby born who's an accident. That every one of us is intended by God. And yet you know as well as I that all the years you and I have been together, every year they say, oh, we're way down now in terms of abortion. We're down to still over 1 million lives lost. And we're living in a country where 2 million couples are seeking every year to adopt a baby, so we've got a home and a family for every child conceived. If we just had the goodness to let the babies be born. We stand on the side of the angels as a church, but we're not victorious yet. In the same way, on every other matter of public policy, whether it's our church's teaching on the undocumented, or John Paul's challenge in terms of the death penalty, or what John Paul has told us about the war in Iraq, which you know he did not support. He thought it was premature as an action. That in every public policy of the Catholic Church, we never win, but it's important to remind ourselves when we examine our loser status that our job is not to win. It is rather to be, as Mother Teresa said, not successful, not victorious, but ever faithful, ever true. Ever faithful, ever true. Which brings me to, I think, the greatest band of losers that ever have been. And that is the wonderful 12 who gathered for the Last Supper, the First Communion. Because there isn't anybody in that room, as far as I can see, maybe John, maybe, who you could say had his act together. You had a group of weak, foolish, sinful men. Interestingly, no women to mess up things. What Father Don said about Filipino women, I'll say for the church in general, without women, there is no church. My mother asked me to mention that to you. But I mention that because look at what they would do. They would deny him, they would desert him, they would run, they would cut, they would hide. And yet, and here is the greatness of what you and I will celebrate in the next hour in the Eucharist. They were invited. They were invited. Do we have the arrogance to believe or to say that Jesus didn't know the stupidity, the weakness, the sinfulness of the people he had chosen? Of course he knew. So why would he gather around the first Eucharist, the first table of his celebration of this sacred meal, those who were so terribly imperfect, those who were all wind and hot air and promises that they couldn't keep? Even if others desert you, Lord, I will lay down my life for you. How much of that does the Lord not know? He knows it all. He even, think about this, he even invites to that meal Judas Iscariot, the one who would betray him. Now, did he not know? Of course he knew. Now, Jesus knows, too, what he's made of, but he still says, come. Judas, as you know, didn't stay for the whole meal. He had something else to do. My point is that each of those imperfect, stupid, sinful men is the bedrock of the church. Were they worthy of the sacrament they received at that first communion? At our human level of thinking, no. But Jesus saw something different. And it is where I'd like to suggest we move in our understanding of the Eucharist. We have come to a point, and I think it's something we need to look at. There are issues very, very real that we need to look at. Of, well, if a person is publicly sinful, should they be receiving communion? And I'm afraid what this suggests is that we have moved, in your lifetime and mine, into an understanding of the Eucharist as some kind of deserved gift or gold star for which I'm worthy. When the reality is, the first Eucharist is given to men who are so massively unworthy. And the Eucharist is given to you and me, often enough in my life, perhaps in yours, massively unworthy. We even institutionalize and concretize our unworthiness just before we receive, when we say together the centurion's prayer, O Lord, I am not worthy to receive you, but only say the word, and I shall be healed. Because your divine grace, your divine mercy fills for my lack and my sinfulness. Now, I'm not saying that this is a meal then that we should go to where we're looking to sin, because Jesus is so accepting that we can get away with it. So keep on sinning and sinning. Obviously, I want us to clear the conscience and live the lives we're called by Jesus to live. I'm not saying that we should be challenging God by saying, you want to see how big a sinner is going to receive communion today? Let me show you how big I can be. We don't want to take the sacrament, both of confession as well as Eucharist, for granted. But I am saying if you're a sinner, and probably most of us here fit that bill, you must wonder to yourself, should I be going to communion? And I'm here to say to you, if you're coming to communion as a sense that you are owed it, deserve it, that you somehow or another have earned, that God himself should come to you in flesh and blood in this sacrament, then maybe you shouldn't come. But if, on the other hand, you stand as the centurion did before a Lord whom you know you are not worthy to receive, and you receive him not because you deserve him, but because we need him, then I believe the sacrament is in fact for you and me. But it brings us to the related issue that we debated the whole past year about who should and who should not come to communion. And specifically, we get into the issue of Catholic politicians. Look, I want to put it to you right plain and simple. I would, any day of the week, rather go out to dinner with an evangelical Protestant in the Senate or the House of Representatives than almost any Catholic there. We have an awful, awful, awful situation in branches of government where people who use their Catholicism to show people they're just like you and me, in fact, thumb their nose at church teaching with impunity. And so the issue becomes, what do you do with them? What do you say? Well, I believe you challenge them to their core, and you say to them rightly that what they're doing in their voting record is absolutely wrong and sinful, and that they cannot hide behind the old, personally, I oppose abortion, but I don't want to impose my morality on others. Can you imagine? Just stick in the word in that same sentence. Personally, I oppose racism, but if you want to be a bigot, that's okay. Or can you imagine someone saying, personally, I oppose child abuse, but if you want to abuse your children, that's your right. None of us would accept that. So where do we get off allowing any politician to say, if you want to kill your preborn child, hey, that's okay by me, but I'm not for it myself? We can't buy that. Because we are fighting in this battle for life the Prince of Lies. We're dealing with an invincible evil. You know, I've been following since I got to your state the voting measure that you have before you this November, and I look at something as simple and as basic as telling a parent that your child who's 14 is going to have an abortion, that we should even have to discuss this and vote on it, is beyond belief. You can't have them go on a school trip. You can't have them have a tooth pulled, but you can't be allowed to know, not give consent, but know that your daughter is going to have invasive surgery from a strange guy doctor who you never get to meet. This is what's now permitted, and all the law is trying to do, and I hope, please God, that you pass it in California, is say that parents have a right to know